In the previous episode, we covered to achieve peace in the Ukraine, we need to understand both Ukraine and Russian military objectives. While the Ukrainian military objectives are very clear to liberate all of the land, Russian objectives in Ukraine are marred by confusion. Therefore, to understand Moscow's bottom line, we need to look at the only other invasion Putin has undertaken during his decade-long rule. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 under similar circumstances. Georgia was eyeing for NATO membership after Bucharest Conference. A similar stalemate to Donbass developed in the region of Abkhazia, where Abkhaz separatist has waged a war with Georgia for decades. Following the election of Vladimir Putin in Russia in 2000 and a pro-Western change of government in Georgia in 2003, relations between Russia and Georgia began to deteriorate, reaching a full diplomatic crisis by April 2008. On 1st August 2008, the Russian-backed South Ossetian forces started shelling the Georgian villages. To put an end to these, Georgian army units were sent into South Ossetian conflict zone on 7th August. In response, the Russian troops crossed the international border and advanced into the South Ossetian conflict zone. Russia accused Georgia of committing genocide and aggression against South Ossetia. It launched a full-scale land, air and sea invasion of Georgia, including its undisputed territories. Russia and South Ossetian forces fought Georgian forces in and around South Ossetia for several days until Georgian forces retreated. Russia and Abkhaz forces opened a second front and Russian naval forces blockaded the Georgian Black Sea coastline. The Russian Air Force attacked numerous targets within and beyond the conflict zone. A negotiated settlement was quickly reached on 12th of August and Russia completed its withdrawal by 8th of October. Russia did not install a puppet government in Tbilisi, and the pre-war President Mikhail goes on to complete his 5-year terms till 2012. Russia withdrew from all the undisputed regions, and conflict resulted in Georgia giving up its aspirations for NATO membership, and the rights of the separatists in Georgia was ensured as an unrecognized autonomous zone was created. So for Ukraine, Russia's bottom line goal before going into the war is also similar, bringing Ukraine to heel with immense pressure, where Zelensky government will be forced to accept Russia's demand of neutrality and acceptance of Donbass as an autonomous region and Crimea as former part of Russia. This is the absolute baseline for Russia and for Putin to claim some sort of victory inside Ukraine. However, it would be right to say that after the loss of thousands of soldiers, the battlefield objectives have changed, and Russia would not settle for anything less than incorporation of the southern Ukraine. So there is obviously a mismatch between the two warring parties, and to find a common ground is not possible in the current situation. Russia has recently announced a partial mobilization, and 300,000 soldiers have yet to join the battlefield. And Ukraine has recently gained strategic victories in Kharkiv and Kherson. Therefore, both parties still believe a victory on the battlefield is possible, and only after achieving battlefield goals, the parties will move to the negotiating table. But is this even a realistic assessment? Ukraine so far has not exhausted its offensive potential. However, with all of the military and the financial support it is getting from the Western allies, it is still doubtful it can sustain the war of attrition with its more powerful neighbor in the long run. For Russia, especially for Mr. Putin, the war is about survival. Not for the survival of Russia as a state, but for the survival of Russian regime. Therefore, his appetite for a long war is greater than for the parties in the West, who are essential for Ukraine victory. Ukraine is expected to lose more than 35% of GDP, and this is after it is being supplied by almost 100 billion euros this year. This is especially troublesome for Ukraine as it was one of the poorest regions of Europe and have a GDP per capita of half of Belarus even before the war. To sustain, Ukraine requires $3 to $4 billion per month just to run its government. This is on top of all the military aid that it needs. And with Russia putting more strain on the civilian infrastructure, the number will only go up. Zelensky reportedly acknowledged that up to 40% of the country's energy infrastructure have been destroyed by Russia. The majority lives in a Soviet-era apartment buildings, many of which would become inhabitable if the airstrikes continue, since they rely on the thermal plants for the central heating. This will result in a tsunami of refugees to the European Union. The mayor of Kiev has already suggested of evacuating up to 3 million people from the capital of Ukraine. In contrast, Russia will see its economy shrink by only 3.5% this year and 2.3% next year. And by 2024, Russia will already have recovered and will be growing at 1.5%. The majority of the 300,000 men that Russia claims to have mobilized have not yet been deployed. In addition, it is increasing its own production while acquiring more drones and highly accurate missiles from Iran. it is cautiously resuming offensive in the Donetsk region while leaving Kherson. The best opportunity for Ukraine to advance in peace negotiation arises when it is on the winning side. Russia's desire for political and territorial trophies will increase tremendously if it once again gains the upper hand on the front lines. Russia's organized withdrawal from Kherson and Washington's subsequent insistence on possibility of talks raises a question on what a peace negotiation would look like. Russian territorial claims goes beyond Donetsk and Luhansk region. Russia also formally annexed the regions of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Although it gave itself some leeway by not defining their boundaries, Moscow still has control over majority of the Kherson region despite leaving the city of Kherson. Putin only needs to hold on to the land it has already controlled to declare victory. He even has room for a greater losses. The conformist majority in Russia has never expressed a real desire for territorial growth or concerns over which portion of Ukraine territory the nation will govern after the peace is restored. Instead of an imperialistic territorial grab, Putin's campaign in Ukraine is more of a punitive operation. Putin will feel vindicated as long as the end of conflict is more humiliating for Ukraine than the fulfillment of Minsk agreements. On the other side, Zelensky is on a mission to live up to the maximalistic aspirations, while also dealing with a hostile opposition that is watching his every move and is prepared to accuse him of betraying Ukraine interest if he even discusses the possibility of negotiations. He must demonstrate that by resisting Russian pressure to implement the Minsk agreements, the huge sacrifice made by Ukraine was not in vain, and they actually are winning. Therefore, Kiev is attempting to regain as much ground as it can while maintaining its momentum. The trick is determining when to draw a line and sue for peace. What then might be the scenario to stop this war in Ukraine to guarantee the survival of Ukraine and also nullifies any risk of nuclear escalation or turning Ukraine into another Syria? We will discuss this in the next video, where I will give a modern day example for such a nation which compromised on its territorial integrity and is now much wealthier and stronger than its aggressor. Also, to understand why Ukraine walks a tightrope between total annihilation and territorial integrity, watch my video on Putin's use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. If you like this video, please like, subscribe and share, as this would help and motivate me to make more content. Thank you and have a good day.